A quiet morning begins inside a small neighborhood cafe. Coffee machines hum softly behind the counter. Ceramic cups touch wooden tables. People sit with newspapers, phones, quiet conversations. Just another ordinary day. At a corner table, a man flips through the pages of a history book. Nothing dramatic on the cover, just old maps, empires. He pauses for a moment, because every page tells a strangely familiar story. Rome believed its power would last forever. The British Empire once ruled a quarter of the planet. The Soviet Union had armies, nuclear weapons, and influence across continents. Each of them believed the same quiet assumption, that their time at the top would continue, that their power was simply permanent. But history has a habit most people rarely notice. Empires don't usually collapse in a single dramatic moment. They fade slowly. Pressure builds. Decisions pile up. Warnings appear long before the fall ever comes. Most people just don't recognize them at the time. The man turns another page. Another empire. Another warning. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because today, one nation holds global influence unlike any other. Military bases across the world. Economic power that shapes entire regions. Cultural influence that reaches nearly every corner of the planet. The United States. And historians are beginning to ask a quiet question. Not about defeat. Not about invasion. But about patterns. Patterns that appeared before the decline of Rome. Patterns that appeared before the fading of the British Empire. Patterns that quietly unfolded inside the Soviet Union. Tonight, we're going to explore those patterns. For empires, for warnings left behind by history, and why their stories may matter more to America today than most people realize. If you enjoy exploring the deeper lessons behind history, power, and the rise and fall of nations, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the most important warnings in history are the ones people only understand much later. War veteran. The afternoon sun hangs quietly over a wide stone road. People move through the marketplace. Merchants shout prices. Children run between wooden carts. Soldiers stand along the road in polished armor. To the people living in this moment, it feels permanent, safe, unbreakable. This is Rome, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. At its height, Rome controlled land stretching from the cold edges of Britain all the way to the deserts of the Middle East. Thousands of miles, different languages, different cultures, all under one empire. And for a long time, it worked. Roman roads connected continents. Roman law shaped entire societies. Roman legions protected borders that seemed almost endless. If you had lived during those years, you probably would have believed the same thing most Romans believed, that Rome would last forever. But history often hides its warnings in quiet details, not in dramatic battles, not in sudden defeats, but in the slow pressure of maintaining something too large. Imagine being responsible for protecting thousands of miles of frontier, forests in Germany, mountains in the Balkans, deserts in Syria. Every mile required soldiers. Every soldier required pay, equipment, food, training. The larger Rome became, the more expensive its power became. And that's where the first cracks began to appear. Legions were stretched thin. Reinforcements took months to arrive. Communication across the empire was slow. Governors ruled distant provinces with enormous independence. Sometimes loyalty faded. Sometimes control weakened. But from the capital, everything still looked powerful. Rome still had its armies. Rome still had its wealth. Rome still had its reputation. And reputation can be a dangerous illusion, because the empire wasn't collapsing overnight. It was simply becoming harder and harder to hold together. Barbarian tribes tested the borders more frequently. Military campaigns lasted longer. Taxes grew heavier to support the growing costs. Inside the empire, people began to feel the strain. Farmers struggled under tax burdens. Soldiers served longer tours on distant frontiers. Political leaders argued about how to manage territories that were now incredibly difficult to control. And here's the uncomfortable part historians often point out. Rome didn't fall because it was weak. It fell while it was still incredibly powerful. Its armies were still feared. Its cities were still massive. Its influence still shaped the world, but the scale of the empire had become its own challenge. The farther power stretches, the harder it becomes to manage every corner. And slowly, the pressure built. More borders to defend, more money required, more instability at the edges, until eventually, maintaining the empire demanded more energy than the system could sustain. Centuries later, historians would look back at Rome and see something fascinating. The warning signs had been there long before the final collapse. Overstretch, military burden, an empire managing responsibilities across half the known world. Now pause for a moment and think about something. Today, there is one country with military presence across continents. Bases in Europe, bases in Asia, bases in the Middle East, naval fleets moving across every major ocean. For many Americans, this presence represents security, strength, global leadership. But historians sometimes look at this kind of reach and remember Rome, not because the situations are identical. History rarely repeats itself in perfect detail, but because the pattern feels familiar. The larger a system grows, the more difficult it becomes to maintain every piece of it. Rome learned that lesson slowly, over decades, then centuries. And at the time, most people living inside the empire never imagined the system could truly break. After all, Rome still looked powerful. From the outside, it still looked unstoppable, which makes one question quietly linger in the background of history. How large can an empire grow before the weight of holding everything together becomes its greatest challenge? War veteran. The sound of waves moves gently against a wooden dock. Ships sit in the harbor. Tall masts, heavy ropes, sailors carrying crates across the planks. A merchant studies a map spread across a small table. Red lines stretch across oceans. India, Africa, Canada, Australia. Nearly every corner of the world touched by the same color, British red. For more than a century, the British Empire stood as the largest empire in human history. At its peak, it ruled over a quarter of the planet. Nearly 1 out of every 4 people on Earth lived under British rule. From London, decisions traveled across oceans. Trade routes connected continents. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. And for many people living during that time, the idea of Britain losing its global position felt almost impossible. After all, how can an empire that large ever fade? But power has a cost, and maintaining global power can slowly become exhausting. Imagine what it meant to govern territories scattered across the world. Different cultures, different languages, different conflicts. Each colony required administrators. Each trade route required protection. Each strategic location needed ships, soldiers, supplies. The system worked for decades because the empire had something incredibly valuable. Momentum. Trade was flowing. Industry was booming. British factories powered global markets. But then the 20th century arrived, and history introduced something empires rarely expect: massive, exhausting wars. The first shock came with World War I. Millions of soldiers mobilized. Resources poured into battlefields across Europe. The war ended, but the cost was enormous. Then, only a generation later, another global conflict arrived, even larger, even more destructive. World War II demanded everything Britain had: ships, factories, money, people. Cities were bombed. Supply lines stretched thin. The empire fought hard and ultimately helped win the war. But victory came with a quiet reality. The British Empire had spent enormous energy holding the world together, and now the system was tired. Debts were rising. Colonies began demanding independence. Maintaining control across continents was no longer as simple as it once seemed. India, one of the empire's most important territories, moved toward independence. Other regions followed. Piece by piece, the map began to change. Not because Britain suddenly became weak, not because an enemy army conquered London, but because the cost of maintaining a global empire had slowly grown heavier than the system could carry. Historians often describe it as something gradual. The empire didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It simply became harder and harder to sustain. The ships still sailed. The institution still existed, but the world had shifted, and Britain could no longer carry the weight of global policing the way it once had. Now pause for a moment, because this is where history becomes quietly interesting. Today, there is one nation with a military presence across nearly every major region of the world. Aircraft carriers crossing oceans, troops stationed across continents, security guarantees for dozens of allies, global stability supported by one enormous system, the United States. For many Americans, this presence represents leadership, responsibility, protection of global order. But historians sometimes look back at the British experience and notice something familiar. Global influence creates global responsibility, and global responsibility requires enormous energy, economic, military, political. The question that quietly emerges from history isn't whether power is valuable. It clearly is. The question is how long any nation can sustain the role of maintaining stability across the entire world. Because the British Empire once seemed permanent too. Its ships ruled the seas. Its flag flew over continents. Its influence shaped global trade and politics. Yet over time, the cost of carrying that system slowly reshaped the empire itself, which leaves a quiet thought historians still debate today. Sometimes empires don't fall in battle. Sometimes they simply reach a moment when the world they manage becomes larger than the strength required to hold it together. A gray winter morning settles over a small grocery store. Fluorescent lights buzz softly above the aisles. A cashier scans items one by one. Somewhere near the back, a radio plays a quiet news broadcast. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary life moving forward. At the end of the counter, a middle-aged man pauses while waiting for his change. He glances at the television hanging in the corner. The news anchor speaks calmly, but the words feel almost unbelievable. The Soviet Union no longer exists. For people watching that moment in 1991, the announcement felt surreal, because for decades, the Soviet Union had been one of the two most powerful forces on Earth. It had nuclear weapons, millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, influence stretching across Eastern Europe and deep into Asia. For nearly half a century, the world had lived under the tension of the Cold War. Two superpowers, two competing systems. And the Soviet Union looked formidable. Its military was massive. Its space program had launched the first satellite. Its ideology had spread across continents. From the outside, it looked like a permanent rival to the United States. But history sometimes hides its biggest turning points behind quiet pressures. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because an invading army marched into Moscow. It didn't lose a final catastrophic battle. Instead, the pressure came from something slower, something internal. Imagine living inside a system where the economy struggles to keep pace with the outside world. Factories working hard, but producing less innovation. Resources flowing heavily toward military competition. Year after year, the leadership poured enormous energy into keeping up with American military technology. More missiles, more submarines, more weapon systems. The arms race never seemed to stop, and every new generation of technology required more money, more scientists, more industrial capacity. But inside the Soviet economy, cracks were forming. Store shelves sometimes sat half empty. Consumer goods were limited. Economic growth slowed. Meanwhile, the government continued to carry the massive cost of maintaining global influence, military commitments, political control across Eastern Europe, and one conflict that quietly drained resources for years. The war in Soviet-Afghan War. What began as an attempt to stabilize a neighboring region slowly became a long, exhausting struggle. Soldiers rotated through difficult terrain. Resources disappeared into a conflict with no clear end. Back home, people began to feel the weight of the system. Reforms were attempted. Leaders tried to restructure parts of the economy. But pressure had already been building for years. And something unexpected began to happen. Control started slipping. Eastern European nations began moving away from Soviet influence. Political tensions rose inside the Union itself. And suddenly, a system that looked immovable began to change very quickly. In late 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. 15 independent nations emerged from what had once been a single superpower. For people watching on television around the world, the moment felt almost unreal because just a few years earlier, few analysts believed the Soviet Union could disappear so quickly. Its military was still powerful, its nuclear arsenal still enormous. Yet the collapse came from inside, from economic strain, from political pressure, from a system struggling to sustain the weight of its global competition. Historians often point to that moment as one of the most surprising geopolitical shifts of the modern era, because it revealed something important about great powers. Sometimes the greatest challenges facing a powerful nation are not external enemies. They are internal pressures that slowly reshape the system from within. Economic strain, political division, strategic exhaustion. And when those pressures build long enough, even the most powerful structures can begin to shift. For decades, the Soviet Union had stood as one half of the world's balance of power. Its influence reached across continents. Its military commanded global attention. Yet in the end, its final chapter unfolded quietly, not with invasion, not with a final battlefield defeat, but with a realization that the system holding everything together could no longer carry its own weight. And moments like that leave historians with an enduring question. If one of the world's most powerful superpowers could transform so quickly under internal pressure, what lessons might other powerful nations learn from that story? The evening is quiet inside a small public library. Soft lights glow above rows of old books. A few people sit at wooden tables, turning pages slowly. Some are studying. Some are simply thinking. Near the history section, a man closes a thick book and rests his hand on the cover. For hours, he has been reading about empires, different centuries, different continents, different leaders. Yet something keeps repeating in the stories. Not the same battles, not the same enemies, but the same patterns. The Roman Empire once stretched across vast territories, believing its system could hold the world together forever. The British Empire ruled oceans and trade routes, shaping global politics for generations. The Soviet Union commanded enormous armies and nuclear power, standing as one of the most formidable forces of the 20th century. 3 empires, 3 different eras, 3 different systems. Yet historians studying them often notice something quietly unsettling. They didn't collapse for completely different reasons. They followed similar paths. Not overnight, not in a single moment, but slowly, step by step. The first pattern often begins with reach. Empires expand. Influence grows. Military power spreads across regions. At first, expansion feels like strength. More allies, more territory, more control. But expansion also creates responsibility. More borders to protect. More alliances to maintain. More crises to respond to. The system becomes larger, more complex, more demanding. Then another pressure quietly appears. Cost. Maintaining global influence requires enormous resources. Armies must be supplied. Infrastructure must be maintained. Economic systems must carry the weight of that power. At first, strong economies handle it. But over time, the burden grows heavier. And then a third pressure emerges. Focus. Empires often face challenges in many places at once. Conflicts on distant frontiers, political debates at home, strategic decisions that affect millions of people across continents. The more responsibilities an empire carries, the harder it becomes to maintain clear direction. And finally, there is something historians often describe as the most unpredictable factor of all: internal tension, political division, social pressure, competing visions about the future. History shows that powerful nations are rarely defeated only by outside enemies. Sometimes the real strain builds quietly inside the system itself. The man in the library slowly gathers his notes. Page after page has described these patterns. Different centuries, different empires. Yet the rhythm feels familiar. And that is where the story becomes especially interesting today. Because there is one nation whose influence reaches across nearly every region of the modern world. Military alliances, economic leadership, cultural influence, a global network of partnerships and responsibilities. The United States. For many people, This global role represents stability, leadership, protection of the international system that has existed since the end of World War II, and it has shaped the modern world in extraordinary ways. But historians studying past empires often look at the present through a different lens, not with predictions, not with certainty, but with questions, because history rarely repeats itself in identical ways. Instead, it echoes. Rome never believed its system could fracture. Britain once seemed permanently anchored at the center of global power. The Soviet Union looked immovable until the moment it wasn't. Each empire had immense strength. Each believed its structure could endure indefinitely. Yet history moved forward. Slowly, quietly, the man walks toward the library door. Outside, the city continues its normal rhythm. Cars move through intersections. Lights glow in apartment windows. People go about their routines without thinking about empires. And maybe that's always how it happens. The most powerful nations rarely feel fragile while they are still strong. History doesn't offer simple answers. It doesn't declare what will happen next, but it does leave behind stories, clues, warnings written across centuries, the rise of great powers, the weight of maintaining them, and the quiet question that always lingers at the end of every empire story, not whether power exists today, but how long any system can carry the responsibility that comes with it. If you enjoy exploring the deeper lessons hidden inside history, power, and global strategy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the most important insights about the future are hidden inside the stories of the past.